those three things that really drive our work around school and classroom culture. And then third, looking at learner engagement. And particularly for us in Kenya, in the context of school reforms, this has been particularly important to think about how we shift from teacher-centered classrooms to learner-centered classrooms, and how we ensure that all of the learning is designed to have the learners as key participants and key drivers of their learning. And what that external evaluation showed, and the evidence we've gathered since, has demonstrated that if we focus on these three areas of development at a school leader level, then in fact we see improved competency gain at a learner level. So just a brief note on school leadership. I know there are different definitions of school leadership across organizations and in different places around the world. So I wanted to just be clear how we understand school leadership. And we understand it quite broadly. We looked at those who are agents of change within a school. And so as you can see from the diagram at the bottom, we think of the head teacher, we think of the deputy, who in our setting is often the instructional lead, and we think of what we call teacher leaders. Those could be senior teachers, teachers on a growth path, and those who are simply aspirational amongst their peers. But we also include the system leaders. I think the equivalent of what in India would be like a district supervisor, and looking at these government officers who have some responsibility over what happens at the local school leadership. And so with our model, we're promoting a shared and distributed leadership across this team. And we try to bring this team together with a focus on learning to really ensure that children are at the center of everything they do as a school leadership team. As I say, we think very seriously about the role of the school leader and how that transforms learning throughout the school. And this is just a worked example in our Kenyan curriculum of how we believe essentially the result chain plays out. So the top line highlights what we believe school leaders can do that will impact on the practice of teachers, that will then impact at the bottom of the slide on children's competency gain. So we essentially join the dots between what we want learners to gain while they're at school, what teachers need to do in and out of the classroom to make that possible, and what school leaders need to do to support each of those steps in the process. Now, we deliver our support to school leaders and teachers by these four means. So we first of all have leadership academies, and this is where we bring school leaders together to really unpack the building blocks of great leadership. We look at growth mindset, emotional intelligence, leadership style, and help them to really understand what it takes to be a great school leader. Then we also have professional development workshops where we're focused on particular strategies, concepts, tools that they can use in their schools and classrooms to improve the quality of learning. And then we have coaching, and we often say coaching is our secret sauce, because all of us have gone for a training workshop, you maybe get a nice handout, you feel great in the moment, but then you go back to the reality of your day-to-day work, and the handout sits nicely on your desk and the busyness of the day-to-day takes over. And many people struggle with taking that theory and putting it into practice. But our coaching model is designed to do exactly that, to make sure that it doesn't stay as theory, but it becomes improved classroom practice and improved leadership practice. So our Dignitas coaches walk hand in hand with our school leaders and take them step by step through a goal setting process, observing them, giving them feedback, helping them to reflect on progress and set new goals on an ongoing basis. So coaching really helps to support changes in how leaders do their jobs. And then finally, we have professional learning communities. And this is where we bring together that school leadership team that I mentioned earlier to focus on learning. We try to make sure that when school administrative or management teams meet, they're not meeting to discuss repairs or the feeding program or things that are not core to learning, but they have at least a portion of that meeting that's really focused on what it is children need to learn and how that learning is taking place. So in all of this, we are working to build these 6 key competencies in our school leaders. And as we've built evidence and interacted with different cohorts of schools over the years, these 6 competencies have emerged as really being core to have school leaders who are focused on instructional leadership, learner engagement, and school and classroom culture. So all of this follows a series of learning or development cycles. And each of those cycles starts with I do, moves to we do, and then eventually you do. And I think that's a framing that many of us will have heard before. And we break that down further into these 5 steps. And so we start with content delivery. So imparting some set of skills or knowledge, some theory to the school leaders. That's actually the smallest part of the process. And then we really dig in around this modeling and practice. So modeling new skills, modeling new concepts, helping them see it in action is really instrumental in then influencing their practice. And then of course, practice, which gives them space to practice what they need to change, a safe space for them to develop new practice alongside their peers. Then off the back of that, they're able to set goals for their own school environments, and those goals are followed up with coaching. And coaching, as I say, follows this cycle here, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, but from setting goals to practice, they're observed by their coach gives them feedback and helps them to reflect, and they set new goals. And all of that is guided by competency frameworks that map out some of these key competencies that school leaders need to develop. Those competency frameworks are aligned with national curriculum. They're designed to motivate educators and nudge the practices that we want to see. And they offer guide to school leaders themselves on how they can push the development of themselves and their teachers in their own schools. So as a result of this, we track impact both at the learner level and the teacher level. So this data you see on the screen now is from one study where we did a pre and post lesson assessment with some groups of learners. And we were comparing children in Dignitas classrooms to children in non-Dignitas classrooms. And what we found was that children in Dignitas classrooms learned about 3 times as much as their peers in non-Dignitas classrooms in the course of a lesson. We also see over time marked improvements in classroom practice. And all of this is measured by observation using the competency rubrics and frameworks that I've mentioned already. So you can see here with month-on-month tracking that there are significant and steady gains in things like classroom management, quality of instruction, planning and preparation for learning, and teacher leadership. And we've gone even further and observed in parallel improved teacher practice and then the learner response. And this has been so that we can see when teachers improve practices like group work or turn and talk, things that they can do under the banner of learner engagement, we see learners collaborating more and better. We see them communicating more and better. We see them asking better questions. And so we track both those improved teacher practices and the learner response. And we can see that those 2 things actually increase kind of hand in hand. It's like a mirror effect. As the teacher practice improves, we see gains collectively across the learners. And we break that down even further. And in the teacher gains are tracking each of these individual practices. Each of these practices has a set of indicators that let us measure over time how those things are being practiced in the classroom. So it's clear that if we invest in school leaders, we can see significant gains for learners. And I've shared just a glimpse into that so far. I want to take a pause there and just open it up for any questions or comments. maybe even something that's coming up in the chat that you'd like to dig into a little further. So feel free, we're not a huge group, so feel free just to unmute and jump in if you have a question or comment. I'd love to hear from some of you.
Hi, Deborah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing about the work that Dignitas is doing. I can see a lot of similarities or parallels to how here also in India, we different education leadership focused organizations approach the whole domain. I had a question about your process of onboarding leaders and how long and what exactly, I mean, have there been any situations where leaders say drop out of the curriculum, or what kind of things that you have done to retain the school leaders throughout the curriculum that is designed by Dignitas? If you could share a bit about that.
Yeah, happy to. I think that's a really important question. I think particularly now, after COVID school closures, and I know while schools have reopened at different times across the world, we've seen some of the same issues emerging. And one of those issues is that teachers are extremely overstretched and really quite stressed. I'm not sure what your situation is there, but here, essentially, our government sent everybody on a kind of a crash course to catch up. So the curriculum has really been jammed into a shorter period of time. There are fewer breaks and holidays and a huge expectation on teachers. And it's a big burden to carry. And so teachers have very little bandwidth for other activities. So what we found to be key is to make sure that this is really something that adds value, that it's something that's making their jobs easier. So every time we're thinking about a training session or a coaching session, we ask our coaches and our facilitators to start with the question of, how are we sure this is making a school leader's job easier? How are we sure this is making a teacher's job easier? We should never be making their lives more complicated. It should always be about facilitating their process of leading, teaching, and learning. Now, of course, that starts right at the beginning, and we're very intentional as to how we engage community, engage other stakeholders around the school, and really make it a community effort. We also recruit schools in geographical cohorts so that there's peer support within the community, so they can have cross-school learning, but also if they are school leaders of neighboring schools, they're able to share that learning experience together. And I think all of us appreciate learning and growing in community rather than kind of in an isolated fashion. So I think it starts from the very beginning. How do you recruit? Who's part of that process? What do you communicate? What expectations do you set? And then how do you implement? How do you think about the other challenges in teachers and school leaders' roles? And how do you not ignore that, but work it into your program, so that teachers and school leaders know that you understand them, you understand where they're coming from, and that you're crafting support in a way that really authentically helps them. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Deborah.
Hi, Deborah. This is Sandhya. I'm sorry not to switch my video on, but I hope I'm audible.
Yes, I think we can hear you. Just go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing your work. It's incredible. What really intrigued me is the M&E aspect of the program that you shared, that how the work with leadership is really impacting the classroom teaching, learning practices and results. Could you share, usually the work with leadership, it's not like a one-year work. You can't say that I work with school principal and it will improve the student learning outcomes, because there are so many factors that impact student learning outcomes at the end of the day. So what were certain changes or what were certain outcomes that you started seeing in the first year, then in the second year and the third year, and how much time it actually took you to kind of create that map that you had shown, where Dignitas versus non-Dignitas school, results that of the students that you demonstrated?
Yeah. So interestingly, when we partner with schools, and now most of our partnerships are one-year partnerships, we we see the biggest gains at an educator level in the first year. And then we see steady gains with learners over the kind of 2-3 year period around that. And I think it's just the first year that we engage school leaders, there's an enthusiasm, and they're kind of picking up so many, I guess, what we'd call low-hanging fruit. So things that they can fix or adjust on relatively easily. And then, of course, the challenge is really embedding those practices over the longer terms. So we tend to see a really sharp increase in the first year, then it kind of plateaus as they make those things regular practices. But what we're also really keen to do is embed mechanisms in the school that ensure they continue on a journey of improvement beyond our partnership. So they have this 1 year of engagement where there's very kind of intensive training and coaching. But then we embed the professional learning communities. Those are supposed to continue beyond our school partnership. The coaching. So we train school leaders to coach their teachers so that that observation and feedback, that coaching support for teachers continues beyond the scope of our partnership. And then we have our alumni program. So through the alumni program, we continue to support those PLCs and coaching, but we also offer other opportunities for them to continue learning, continue engaging with their peers, and engage with other actors in the education space as well. So through the alumni program, then it really becomes this space of lifelong learning, but the most intensive engagement is indeed in that first year. But I think the key thing is what, in any program like this, what can you embed that ensures the impact doesn't end when your partnership or when the one intensive year ends? And what practices, what mindsets can you embed so that the improvement continues long after the partnership ends? So hopefully that helps a little to answer your question.
It does.
Thank you so much.
I have a follow-up question. Again, just intrigued to understand how the work distribution of a school leader looks like in Kenya. For example, in India, there's so much of administrative work that these leaders are doing that for instructional leadership, they hardly have any time in their day to support teachers or to work on the instructional leadership aspects. So is it the same case? And if it is, then how are those challenges being worked upon?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's the same here. And in fact, that's why I'm just going back to the slides. In this slide, we highlight that often it's the deputy head teacher who's the instructional lead. And that's exactly just what you said. The head teacher is distracted with other things. And what we find also is the head teacher often doesn't have any time in the classroom. And we insist that the person who is leading instruction, who's offering coaching to the other teachers, they themselves have to be in the classroom at some point so that they can model, so that they can support, so that they can observe. So it's usually the deputy head teacher who fulfills the role of the instructional leader. But the head teacher has to be part of the process because they have to understand the changes that the deputy head teacher is driving. There has to be a shared approach amongst the leadership to driving the change that they want to see. But in the school on a day-to-day basis, at a classroom level, it's the deputy head who typically is that instructional leader.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I see there's a question in the chat here around who trains the school leaders. And this is an interesting question. So we in Kenya have kind of a split in the education system. So we have low-cost private schools, which I know there are also many of in India. And then we have public or government schools. So in the low-cost private schools, there's very little support from the government. So in theory, there are some of these officers in the yellow box here assigned to those schools, but they don't really offer the support that's required. And so we typically coach those schools directly. We have our own team of coaches, leadership coaches, who spend their time in the field offering that support to these schools. With the government schools, we try and work hand in hand with these officers that you see listed here. Now, one of the challenges and one of the things we're actually working to figure out this year is how do we better support those officers so that they better support school leaders? Because sometimes you get one of these officers who's very enthusiastic, completely committed, and can really carry that mantle well. But sometimes you get one who doesn't really engage well, perhaps doesn't fully understand it, and really struggles to deliver the support we expect to see. And so what we're trying to understand is more generally across the board, how do we better support these kind of systems actors or these officials to be able to deliver the quality of support that we need at a school and classroom level. So hopefully that answers the question in the chat, I think, from Sakshi.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. That that actually answers the question, and I have a follow-up to that. So in government schools, you talked about that there are some education leaders in the system. So I'm curious to know that what does the structure look like in Kenya? Like in India, we have hub leaders, then we have cluster leaders, district, block leaders. So how does it really work there? If you could share something about it.
Yeah, sure. So typically at a school level, we would obviously have the deputy head and the head, but we would also have what we call a curriculum support officer. So the curriculum support officer is assigned by the Teacher Service Commission to support for curriculum implementation. But we also have what we would call a quality assurance officer. And the quality assurance officer is appointed by the Ministry of Education sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I show you my slide with the email address because I see we're about to wrap up. So that the quality assurance person is assigned by Ministry of Education. Now, one of our challenges is we have quite segmented support for education, because besides those two, we also have a county level, and I think our county would be equivalent to the districts that you have in India. So at a county level, we have another set of officials who have some oversight responsibility. So you have at least 3 or 4 different regulatory agencies, in theory offering support at a school level, but often what that means is that all of them step back and do nothing. And so sometimes it's a battle for power, sometimes it's just an assumption that if somebody else is there, I don't need to be there. Sometimes we see great collaboration across those actors, but unfortunately that's not the norm. So I think that segmentation is a real challenge, and something alongside other education actors we're trying to address. But it has a long political history in Kenya's education sector as to how it's come to be. So it's not the easiest thing to solve.
Yeah, completely agree. Thank
I think we have 1 minute left. So sorry. Did you have a follow-up?
No.
Okay. So I can attempt to answer one last question, but I've also just put this slide on the screen that has my contacts or my colleagues' contacts. So do feel free to use that to reach out if there are questions we haven't had time to answer. I see there is one more question in the chat about building bridges between the school and the community. So just to very quickly say, what we try to do is give the school leaders the skills to do that. So equip them to build those key relationships in their community.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone have one very last quick question? If not, thank you all so much for being such a wonderful, engaging audience. It's been such a privilege to share with you all. And I look forward to interacting further, either here on email or in other spaces.